This Saturday on the Big Ten Network, the Wisconsin Badgers, who stand at 3-2 and 1-1 in Big Ten Conference play, travel to Piscataway, New Jersey to face off against the Rutgers Scarlet Knights, who are 4-1 overall and also 1-1 in Big Ten Conference play. And I will tell you that this is a critical matchup for the Badgers and the Scarlet Knights because of the schedules they have set before them. For Wisconsin, they need to find 3 more wins to go bowling. That's really their goal for this season because they played Alabama in the non-conference. They have yet to play Penn State and Oregon, who they thankfully get at home, but they also hosted Alabama at home, and they lost that matchup in a 42-10 blowout. And they need to find wins. They travel to Northwestern after playing against Rutgers in SHI Stadium, and then after that, they have this stretch where they host Penn State, travel to Iowa, host Oregon, travel to Nebraska. There's a bye in between that Iowa and Oregon game. Then they host Minnesota. That final 5-game stretch, really that 4-game stretch, starting on October 26th, is brutal. They could easily go 0-4 in that stretch. Maybe escape with the win in those 4 games, but a win at most is what they'll probably escape with there. And that looks unlikely right now. I think all of those teams are better than Wisconsin. And Rutgers is a 2.5-point favorite. They opened up as such, and the line has remained there at 2.5. So this is a big game for Wisconsin because Northwestern is a winnable game. Minnesota is a winnable game. This game is winnable. Maybe Iowa on the road and Nebraska on the road are winnable, but that doesn't mean they're going to be favored. They're going to lose some of those games, and as of right now, they're definitely going to lose to Oregon and Penn State. So they need to find as many wins as they can. And for Rutgers, well, they were delivered a schedule on a platter that is one of the easiest I have ever seen. Even when you take into account past Big Ten West schedules, this takes the cake compared to most of them, because at least most of your Big Ten West schools had to face one of Ohio State, Penn State, or Michigan. And typically those schools in the existence of the Big Ten East and West, and occasionally Michigan State, were really good. They were formidable. The only schedule I can think of, and there's definitely more than this, but one that is just off the top of my head that I can mention that is comparable to this in terms of how easy this schedule is Wisconsin's schedule in 2017, where the toughest opponent they had to play in the regular season was an 8-4 Michigan team in the regular season, and I think Iowa that same year went 7-5, 8-4. I don't remember exactly, but it was a very easy, light regular season schedule. It's why that Wisconsin team, despite being statistically dominant and playing Ohio State in a competitive game in the Big Ten Championship, was left out of the playoff after losing in Indy because their strength of schedule was light. That's the case with this Rutgers team. After they play Wisconsin this Saturday, they host UCLA, travel to USC, get a bye, then they host Minnesota, travel to Maryland, host Illinois, travel to Michigan State. There is no Ohio State, no Penn State, no Oregon, no Iowa, no Michigan. Michigan and Iowa aren't all that, but they're still teams that could be in the upper half of the Big Ten. I'd say Iowa likely is. Michigan, I really question that. And then, of course, Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State, those are by far the top 3 schools in the Big Ten right now and the best in this conference. So I'm going to break this game down, a critical matchup that takes place again on the Big Ten Network at noon Eastern time. And for all of you Wisconsinites, well, that's 11 a.m. kickoff in the Central Time Zone. But before we get going, please hit the subscribe button, hit that like button, click the notification bell, comment your prediction for this game down in the comment section below, and share this video and channel around with other college football fanatics that you know. Join our Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. Whichever works, just click the link. And join our Discord server where we are dedicated to talking about college football every day. And if you want to go the extra mile and support the channel monetarily, check out my Patreon page and merchandise store via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. But liking, sharing, commenting, hitting the bell, subscribing, and joining the Discord server and watching this video all the way through, those are the things that you can do to best help us, and all of those things are free and won't take that much time. Let's look at these teams from a bird's eye view, and then we can fly closer and get a better picture of the details. Wisconsin is viewed as 4.5 points superior to the average college football team per FPI. A lot of that comes from the fact that they just housed Purdue 52-6 this past weekend, and they're viewed as 8.6 points superior to the average college football team in S&P Plus. For similar reasons, Wisconsin was one of the biggest risers post Week 6. One of the biggest, I kid you not. And Rutgers, meanwhile, they didn't fall a whole lot after losing to Nebraska, but they're sitting right now at about 5.5 points better than the average college football team in FPI. I actually think they rose in FPI after that loss to Nebraska. And then in S&P Plus, they're viewed as 7.9 points better than the average college football team. These are viewed as pretty equal rosters, as pretty equal teams. They both returned a lot of production entering this year from their 2023 teams, both of which went... Actually, Rutgers went 6-6 in the regular season. Wisconsin went 7-5 in the regular season. So both were just hovering around that 500 mark, but bowl eligible. Wisconsin was a game above that. They lost their bowl game to LSU, and Rutgers beat Miami in their bowl game. Funny how all of that works. Miami right now being 6-0, and, well, they lost to Rutgers in their bowl game. But that's what opt-outs will do to you, and that's also what being a motivated team will do for you in a positive way. Rutgers being a well-coached team, well-motivated, they know their identity. Wisconsin seems a little bit flat-footed right now. They do not have a grip on things, in my opinion, and are still trying to figure out what their identity is in year 2 of head coach Luke Fickell taking the reins and becoming the CEO of this program. You look at the points per play margin of both of these teams. Points per play margin is basically the points that your team scores per single play measured up against the points that your average opponent scores per one of their plays. On an average basis, Wisconsin has a negative, they have a negative points per play margin, which means they have a negative points per play differential between themselves and their opponents. That means Wisconsin's opponents score just over a 100th more of a point per play than Wisconsin does. And a lot of that circles back to the Alabama game, where they just got destroyed. And there's also the USC game, where Wisconsin benefited from a lot of turnovers from the Trojans in the first half, but the Trojans shut out the Badgers in the second half and won very convincingly. As for Rutgers, they have a 0.089 points per play margin, so they score just under 1/10 of a point more than their opponent does per play. Specifically 0.089 more points per one of the Scarlet Knights plays compared to their average opponent plays. And as for game control, the strength of schedule that these two teams have, Wisconsin has one of the tougher strength of schedules in the Big Ten, because they played Alabama. They've already played USC on the road. Theirs is 20th nationally, and their game control is 37th nationally. For Rutgers, they're 27th in game control, and their strength of schedule is 73rd. Game control factors in strength of schedule already. So what game control is, it's a metric that basically measures how good would any given college football team do against the schedule of the team that we're looking at. So as for Rutgers, 26 teams would be projected to perform better against Rutgers' schedule than Rutgers has so far this season. And as for Wisconsin, well, 36 teams would be expected or projected to perform better than Wisconsin has with their own schedule. So Rutgers is viewed as a more dominant team and as about a similar caliber team, if not slightly better or at least less volatile than Wisconsin, despite having the inferior strength of schedule. I think the critical matchup here ultimately is Wisconsin's defense against Rutgers' rushing attack. And I don't think that any other matchup matters nearly as much as this one, because if Rutgers can do what they want to do, and they failed to do this against Nebraska, it's why they had so many turnovers, both on fourth down and Kaliak Manis throwing 2 interceptions. If they can just run the football, this game's over, because they're better at running the football than Wisconsin is. Be praying for Ches Malusi because he's out indefinitely, and also for Tyler Van Dyke because he's out from an ACL tear. Those 2 losses are huge for Wisconsin. And I'm not going to pretend that if they had those players that they would be this elite team either. But those players are better than the players that are replacing them, perhaps significantly better. They very much, those losses hurt Wisconsin and their cause and their quest to find enough wins in this tough schedule to go bowling, to really tread water here. Rutgers, meanwhile, as I've already expressed with their schedule is so weak that they could legitimately win out. I don't think that's necessarily likely given what we saw against Nebraska, but it's possible. They could win out from here or go 10-2, and at that point they may be in play for the college football playoff and certainly for their best bowl appearance in well over a decade. And with the Rutgers rushing attack going up against a Wisconsin defensive line and rushing defense that hasn't been all that impressive, this is the ultimate matchup here. It is. You look at Wisconsin so far this season, and the Badgers are currently running for 4.4 yards per attempt, which is 61st. It's better than Rutgers, who's running for 4.3 yards per carry. And Rutgers is averaging right now 175 rushing yards per game. Wisconsin's 169.8. Wisconsin did very well against Purdue running the ball. That was about the only game where they really had tremendous success on the ground. Rutgers had tremendous success through their first 4 games, but Nebraska put the clamps on that Rutgers rushing offense. To just give you some details about that, Rutgers only ran for 2.4 yards per carry on Nebraska on 32 carries. Monungai averaged more than 4 yards per carry, 4.1 to be specific, but Timmy Ward and Nathan Kaliak-Manis either had no rushing yards or negative total yards due to sacks, and Samuel Brown V, he only had 4 yards per carry flat. So against the best defense that they've played so far this season, Rutgers had minimal success on the ground. But Nebraska has one of the nation's and one of the Big Ten's better defenses. You look at these rushing defenses, meanwhile, Rutgers is pretty bad, but they did better against Nebraska than Akron and Virginia Tech and Washington. Those 3 teams had better performances against Rutgers' rushing defense than Nebraska's rushing offense did, which I think showcases that Nebraska has some issues running the football. But Rutgers, they improved to 5.4 yards per rush attempt, allowing 10 rushing first downs per game and 162.3 rushing yards per game. They are outside of the top 75 in those categories, but they improved after that Nebraska game. Wisconsin is not much better, though. They are allowing 4.4 opponent yards per rush attempt, 7 rushing first downs per game, and 140.5 rushing yards per game. And teams like to run on Wisconsin more than Rutgers. Wisconsin on average faces 32.3 opponent rushing plays per game. Rutgers just faces about 30 flat. And Rutgers, we know with the offensive line they have and with Kyle Monungai at running back compared to what Wisconsin has, that I think Rutgers is the better rushing attack. I think that's pretty obvious here. And with home field advantage, with a defense overall that I think is very well coached and really plays a bend but don't break, they do a very good job of bowing up in their own territory. I think what Wisconsin needs to do is they need to shut down the run game. And if Will Pauling is healthy, which I don't know if he is going to be playing against Rutgers, that's huge because Wisconsin, I think, has a higher ceiling in the passing attack than Rutgers does. So if they can make it a passing game like how Nebraska versus Rutgers was, at least for the Scarlet Knights, Raiola tried to pass and had one of his worst performances, actually his worst performance of the season, objectively. But if Wisconsin can force Rutgers to throw like Nebraska did, that very much plays to the benefit of Wisconsin. If it is a tempo-controlled game, a game where Rutgers is able to run the football, then I have a very hard time seeing Wisconsin win because Alabama was able to run all over them. And while Wisconsin has shown that they can create a drive together, and I think their offense is better than it was last year, even with Braden Locke in, they're still very, very, very inconsistent. And remember, they were only leading Purdue, I think, by 15 points at the half, or maybe less. It was really in the second half where they were pouring it on against the Boilermakers. So this Wisconsin team, and Rutgers as well, but really Wisconsin, I think they do have some issues, and it would be very good of them to focus on stopping this Rutgers rushing offense. It'd be very beneficial, not just for their defense, but also for Wisconsin's own offense, because I think that they will take a few drives and series to get something going against this Rutgers defense. Offensively, I like Wisconsin at wide receiver. I think that both of these quarterbacks are pretty even Steven, and I like Rutgers at running back, tight end, and offensive line more than I like Wisconsin in those areas. Take a look at these quarterbacks. Braden Locke right now is 46 of 83 for 664 yards, 5 touchdowns, 3 interceptions. Kaliak Manis is 74 of 133 for 947 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 3 interceptions. Locke has a 48.8 QBR. Kaliak Manis has a 57.3 QBR. The reason I made this as a push is Locke has played Alabama, USC, and Purdue. I mean, and USC and Alabama, those are just tough games to throw a backup QB into. And those two teams and Nebraska and Washington are, I would say, in the category of at worst above average. And as for Alabama, at best, they're probably a near elite team or maybe an elite team that just had a flukish performance against Vanderbilt. But Kaliak Manis did a horrible job against Nebraska. Against Washington, he was rated highly in QBR, but he had just a 112.3 passer rating. Locke did pretty poorly against Alabama and also against USC. Against Purdue, he had a 173.9 QBR and a 180.8 passer rating. But Purdue is gutter trash. Purdue is absolutely awful. And I do think that Ryan Walters is going to probably be fired by the end of the year unless something changes because, well, Purdue's schedule is very tough. I mean, they play Ohio State, for example. I think they play Oregon as well. Those are going to be some games where more 50 burgers are hung on the Boilermakers. But we're talking about the Badgers and the Scarlet Knights here. I just have this feeling that maybe because Locke was thrown into multiple hurricanes. Meanwhile, Kaliak Manis has had a weaker strength of schedule, and he, well, had games against Howard and Akron and Virginia Tech and Washington. 4 of those teams are worse than USC and much worse than Alabama. So I'm just trying to adjust for that a little bit, and maybe Wisconsin does have the better QB play, but if you put a gun to my head right now, I would pick Kaliak Manis as my quarterback over Locke. As for Wisconsin has a very underrated wide receiver room. They've had success at the wide receiver position in the past, and also a little bit this season too. I don't know, again, if Will Pauling is back from his injury or not that he sustained against Purdue, but he has 202 receiving yards on the year, 1 receiving touchdown and 21 receptions where he leads the team by a mile. Bryson Green, Tretch, Kakuna, and Vinny Anthony II are also receivers that have 150 receiving yards or more, with Kakuna and Anthony II having 2 receiving touchdowns. CJ Williams also has more than 100 receiving yards, and he has 1 receiving touchdown. In total, Wisconsin has passed for 1,088 yards this season, 6 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, an average passer rating among all the QBs of a 128.4. On the ground, they have 850 rushing yards, 4.4 yards per carry, and 11 rushing touchdowns. Tawi Walker leads the team in rushing yards with 241, 4.2 yards per carry, 6 rushing touchdowns. His now backup Cade Yakimelli has 192 rushing yards, averaging 7.4 yards per carry, and he has 1 rushing touchdown. You look at Rutgers here, specifically you want to pay attention to, obviously, Kyle Monangai, who has 667 rushing yards, 6 touchdowns, 5.8 yards per carry. Samuel Brown V has 184 rushing yards, 5.1 yards per carry, 3 rushing touchdowns. Something I forgot to mention early when I was reading stats for these teams from TeamRankings.com is TeamRankings.com doesn't track FBS teams' statistics against FCS opponents, which I think is understandable because almost all FBS teams beat their FCS opponents, especially ones that are worth talking about. But ESPN counts those statistics against FCS opponents, which, is what it is. I'm just saying it because you just heard me talk about Rutgers' 2 leading rushers, and they're averaging over 5 yards per carry. And on the season, Rutgers is averaging 5 yards per carry flat. But you take out the FCS game, and their offense understandably compresses to be closer to Wisconsin's because Wisconsin hasn't played. Actually, they did play an FCS team, and they did not do so well against them. So I think it may actually be fair to include the FCS data here. But anyway, enough of my rambling. What I'm trying to say here is I think Rutgers actually has the better offense, at least in terms of consistency, formulating an identity. They're much better at running the football, in my opinion. And also the 2 tight ends for these schools. The main one's Kenny Fletcher for Rutgers, 120, 130 receiving yards and 19 receptions and 2 touchdowns. He's a reliable target. As for Wisconsin, you have Riley Nowakowski, Tucker Ashcraft, JT Seagreaves, all of whom at least have 20 receiving yards. Nowakowski has 52 receiving yards on 5 receptions. Tight ends are not used as much from what I can see at Wisconsin compared to Rutgers. That's why I give Rutgers the edge at tight end right here. Defensively, I would give Rutgers defensive tackle. I'd give them linebacker and corner. There's a push at defensive end and also safety, though, where you put a gun to my head and I'm not exactly sure who I would take. With Hunter Wohler in that defensive backfield for Wisconsin, I might lean toward the Badgers at safety. And both of these teams, when you look at pass rush, have not exactly done all that impressive of a job. Rutgers only has 8 sacks on the year, 4 interceptions, 3 forced fumbles. Wisconsin, meanwhile, has 10 sacks, 2 interceptions, 2 forced fumbles. So neither of these defenses have been very statistically impressive in a variety of ways. I will say, though, that Rutgers, I think, has done a pretty good job in defending the pass, especially for how poorly their run defense has performed. Rutgers is only allowing 6.1 opponent yards per pass attempt, which is 21st, and 10.8 opponent yards per completion, which is 33rd. People are only completing an average of, let me find it here, they're only completing 56.35% of their passes on this Rutgers secondary, which is 25th. Rutgers only allows 6.3 opponent passing first downs per game, and their opponent average team pass rating is a 110.5. All those things that I mentioned, top 25, and they're 6th in opponent passing first downs per game. Wisconsin, though, is a 6.09 sack percentage. Rutgers only has a 5.26, and Wisconsin has played tougher competition. Both average about 1.8 sacks per game. Again, that's factoring out from the statistics that I'm reading the games against FCS opponents. So I would view Wisconsin as better at getting to the quarterback, that they have the better pass rush. Aaron Lewis right now, it seems like he's having another year just like last year where he's a good player, but he's not getting to the quarterback. And then Keontae Hamilton, Malcolm Ray, Jordan Thompson, that defensive line for Rutgers, they're improving, getting better at stopping the run, but it doesn't seem like this is going to be an effective pass rush defense. For Wisconsin, it's a similar story. Ben Barton, Kurt Neal, Aaron Witt, Jake Chaney, and then Leon Lowry Jr., John Pius, Daryl Peterson. those outside linebackers for Wisconsin, Witt, Peterson, Lowry Jr., and Pius are often used as defensive ends, and then Ben Barton and Kurt Neal are the interior defensive players. Wisconsin, I think, does have depth at defensive end or really at edge with the system that they run, and they do have depth at linebacker. Rutgers, though, did return a starter from last year who got injured in Tyreen Powell, and Moses Walker has had a good performance this year for the Scarlet Knights. So I would take their linebacker room over Wisconsin's. I'd take their interior defensive tackle room. I think the Badgers have one of the worst defensive tackle units in the entire Big Ten. And it's not a good defensive tackle unit even when you expand it out to the Power 4. Looking at these defenses, overall, I would side with Rutgers here, and I would take Aaron Lewis, Keontae Hamilton, Malcolm Ray, Jordan Thompson, Moses Walker, Tyreen Powell, Eric Rogers, Shaquan Loyal, Flip Dixon, Robert Longerbeam, and Desmond Igbinosun over Ben Barton, Kurt Neal, Aaron Witt, Jake Chaney, Jaheim Thomas, Leon Lowry Jr., Ricardo Hallman, Hunter Wohler, Preston Zachman, Nazir Forquirin, and Max Lofi. Maybe it's Laffy. Ricardo Hallman, by the way, has not had a very good season. He has not been graded highly by Pro Football Focus, but more importantly than his PFF grade, just look at his statistics this season. He does not even have a single interception, and we are 5 games in. And he only has 2 passes defended, 7 total tackles, no forced fumbles, no fumble recoveries. He's not having the season that he had last year, not even close. Maybe it's because they're playing better passing offenses. I mean, USC had a better passing offense than a lot of Big Ten teams did last year, and this is Lincoln Riley's worst passing offense, I think, of his career as a head coach. And Alabama with Jalen Milroe and Ryan Williams, I think, at a passing offense with a higher ceiling than anyone Wisconsin played outside of maybe LSU in the postseason last year to conclude the 2023 season. I look in the trenches. I would favor Rutgers because I think they have the better defensive line and the better offensive line. Look at these offensive linemen. This is the strength of both of these offenses. It's defense. Holland Pierce and Tyler Needham at tackle for Rutgers, Brian Felter and Kwabena Asamoah at right guard, and Gus Salinskis at center. Those starting 5 are one of the best starting 5 on the offensive line in America. And then as for Wisconsin, you got Jack Nelson and Riley Malman at tackle, Joe Brunner and Joe Huber at guard, and Jake Renfro at center. I would take Rutgers ahead of Wisconsin, not just at some positions on the offensive line, but at every position on the offensive line. But I do think Wisconsin is pretty close to Rutgers on both the O-line and D-line. They're just a step back at both. So that's that. And as for special teams, both of these units are efficient. They're not world beaters. They're not like some of the past Iowa or South Carolina special teams in the past few seasons, but they are pretty good. Right now, Wisconsin has a field goal kicker in Nathaniel Vakos, who's 6 of 8 with a long of 53s, 2 of 2 from 50 plus, and 16 of 16 in extra points. You look for Rutgers. Jai Patel is 2 of 5 on the year. Ouch. And his long is of 36, and he's missed 2 from 50 plus. He is 19 of 19 in extra points, though, was a pretty good kicker last season. And Rutgers special teams are disciplined and they're sound. So I think that these special teams units are close to equal. I'd say close to good. If I had to lean one, given the kicking struggles that Patel has had, though granted he hasn't had many attempts, I may lean Wisconsin slightly here. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's special teams. It's important, but it's not as important as offense, defense, or trench warfare. And finally, as for coaching, I think these staffs are pretty darn even. I think each of these teams have really good staffs. Their strength and conditioning is great. It's one of the better strength and conditioning units for both of these schools, I'd say, in the Big Ten. Defensively, I like where both of these defensive coordinators and their assistants are. They're not quite Jim Knowles or Phil Parker level, and I don't know if they have the assistant coaches that, let's say, Penn State does on defense, but they do a pretty good job. Offensively, this is where I think there's some weakness in these staffs. Kirk Shiraka, we know that his offenses from his time at Minnesota, they are limited, and he's had success at Minnesota and Rutgers. His sole stop at Penn State, whether you blame that on the COVID year or not, was an unmitigated disaster. That's why he was fired after a year. You look at head coach, though, and I think that both Luke Fickell and Greg Schiano are proven program builders. And I do think that in the long haul, and it's difficult because the Big Ten is 18 teams right now, and not everyone can be a championship contender. But I think in the long term, Wisconsin and Rutgers both should have optimism for their programs as opposed to pessimism, like the type of pessimism that Northwestern and at this point probably Purdue should have for their programs moving forward. My prediction for this game is that Rutgers covers and that they win, I think by a score of 20-10. Rutgers right now is a 2.5-point favorite. If you're picking Rutgers to win, unless it's maybe you're expecting it to go to double overtime, both get a touchdown, but Rutgers just converts the 2-point conversion, then Wisconsin covers, which would be really funny, or pass second overtime and they go in for a 2-point conversion battle and Rutgers wins. Outside of that scenario or something crazy in regulation, if you're picking Rutgers to win, you're probably going to pick them to cover. It's this same thing, obviously, with if you're picking Wisconsin to win, you're going to pick them to cover. I like Rutgers here because they're at home. They're coming off of a loss that has got to leave a bitter taste in their mouth, and I think they're going to respond to it because I think they have a strong culture, strong head coach, they're experienced, and their identity is closer to being molded, closer to being complete, and may already be complete compared to Wisconsin, who is still searching, almost with a blindfold on, for their identity. And I really love Kyle Monangai and that offensive line and the underrated weapons that Rutgers has on offense too, and I think their defense is going to continue to make strides weekly. As for Wisconsin, if there's a path for them to win, it's what they do is they stack the box. They play an awesome game in the secondary where they force some turnovers from Kaliak Manis, and they also are stout up front, make their tackles, make Rutgers question their strategy of wanting to run the football, and they get a win on the road. It's possible. I think this is going to be a low-scoring game. That means big plays will matter even more. The margin of error for both of these teams, whether it's by play design and strategy for Rutgers or the limitations of being in a rebuild year for Wisconsin, the margins are razor thin. I just think Rutgers comes out on top in this one. Thank you all so much for watching this video. Remember to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Thanks to Crash2488 and Nebraska Rascal for being Heisman members. Thanks to Conolulu OH also for joining as a Heisman member after being a longtime All-American member. And thanks to Chris Lane, Ismar, Tyler 9, Chilton Cush for being All-American members. And to John Lynn, Roaming Gnome, Matthew Sale, Austin Christmas, Joshua Jorgensen, and Will Loftus, thank you for being all-conference members. Have a great day, everyone. Make sure to check out my merchandise store, Patreon page, and Discord server via the link in the description or down below in the pinned comment. I will see you all very soon. Go Badgers and go Knights.